my talk will be quite different from the ones that preceded me. It seems that it's my fortune to deal with such controversial topics as the Ukrainians and the Jews during the Second World War. But then when one considers that it is precisely controversial topics that make things interesting, why should I choose anything else? Now, dealing with the problem of the Ukrainian-Jewish relations during World War II, one has to realize that one really has to go beyond a historical record. It seems to me that the problem is as much a historical as a psychological one. A student of this highly controversial topic has, it seems to me, to face two very difficult tasks. One, he has to master the rather incomplete and often contradictory evidence, and two, he has to deal courageously and forthrightly with the mythology that both Ukrainians and the Jews developed and continue to cultivate about each other's characteristics and historical performance. It is precisely this mythology that produced negative stereotypes which irresponsible writers elevate to the level of a national policy, thus keeping both communities in a state of permanent confrontation. It seems to me that neither group will, in the long run, benefit from this sordid relationship. In a way of a generalization, it might be added that the relationships between the Jews and the Ukrainians were never free of outside interference. There was always a third factor, a dominant power which exercised a decisive influence. In the 20th century, the Ukrainian-Jewish relations stood, I would say, in the shadow of communist Russia and Nazi Germany. Now, as far as World War II is concerned, it is probably fair to say that the Ukrainian community in the West Ukrainian lands found itself leaderless, somewhat confused and bewildered, since the political parties which enjoyed a considerable support in the 1930s dissolved themselves in the very beginning of the war. The power vacuum thus created was gradually filled by a new dynamic and rapidly growing force, namely the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, whose central objective was to create an independent Ukrainian state. In April of 1941, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists held its second Congress in Krakow, and I will not go into all the details, all the controversies, though they are familiar to me. And it was at this Congress where, among other things, the UN adopted also a resolution concerning the Jews, a rather controversial resolution. Point 17 of the resolution read, and I quote, "The Jews in the USSR constitute the most dedicated support for the ruling Bolshevik regime and the vanguard of Muscovite imperialism in Ukraine. The anti-Jewish feelings in the Ukrainian masses are being used by Muscovite Bolshevik government in order to deflect their attention from the real perpetrators of evil and in order to channel them at the time of an uprising into pogroms of Jews." One has to listen to the formulation very carefully. The ON is fighting against the Jews as a support of the Muscovite Bolshevik regime. At the same time, it makes the popular masses conscious that the main enemy is Moscow. If you read the point 17 several times, you still will have doubts. What is it that was said here? Was it a statement against the Jews? Or was it a statement against the Jews as allies of the communists? It is a very, it's open to many interpretations. Analyzing this passage, the late Philip Friedman, an outstanding scholar, concluded that it reflected, quote, the classical Nazi anti-Jewish equation of Jews, Bolsheviks. That's his interpretation. Of course, it is also possible that the ON adopted such a resolution because it reflected the views of the Ukrainian population. Whether it was founded in fact is another question, which deserves a careful study if we are to get rid of this myth, for some people reality, which lies deeply buried in the social consciousness. I would submit that it was the popular perception of Jews as agents of Bolshevism, not the OUN resolution, which resulted ultimately in the mass outbursts against the Jewish people during the initial stages of German-Soviet war, in which thousands of people suffered. Besides, it should be noted, as does Philip Friedman in his excellent article on the Ukrainian-Jewish relations during World War II, that the ON resolution warns, quote, against pogroms on Jews, since such actions only played into the hands of Moscow. It should be also noted that as a result of a 2-year struggle against the Nazis, the ON, which of course created a formidable underground movement, created a gigantic insurgent army, the only insurgent army in Europe which was not helped by anybody, an army which by German calculations was anywhere from 80 to 100,000 strong. In the course of the anti-Nazi struggle, it also modified its ideology. It modified its ideology in several very important respects. One, it espoused the principle of popular sovereignty or democracy. And two, it modified its stand on national minorities of Ukraine. Particularly significant for our discussion is the anti-Jewish point 17 of the Krakow Congress, which was annulled at the Congress of 1943. It was replaced by a provision which called A, for the full right of national minorities to cultivate their own national culture, and B, for the equality of all citizens of Ukraine regardless of their nationality. Even more articulate on the Jewish question was the official organ of the ON, Ideya I Czyn, or in English, Thought and Action, Volume 2, Number 2, 1943. In an article containing instructions to the Pochidni Gruppe, or the march groups, the third paragraph urges man, and I quote, to liquidate the manifestations of harmful foreign influence, particularly the German racist concepts and practices, end of quote. In the meantime, of course, prior in this period between 41 and 43, the popular perceptions made themselves felt in in practical policies. Generally speaking, we may say that these perceptions played into the hands of the Nazis, who hoped to enlist the various peoples of Eastern Europe, not just the Ukrainians, in their anti-Jewish campaign. That is well documented. Towards that end, they conducted vigorous propaganda whose objective was to prove to the Ukrainians and others that Jews were the architects of much of the tragedy that they suffered under the communist regime. The inflamed populace gave vent to their emotions, particularly in the cities in which large number of Ukrainian prisoners were found murdered by the NKVD. Jews were accused of complicity in the crime, with the result that mobs attacked and abused the Jewish population. The reporting on these attacks and abuses varies, and I have studied the German archives very carefully, and I have the German reports, I have read what the Jewish authors had to say, the eyewitnesses, and I must say they don't really agree with each other very often. I am discounting that problem because I am yet to finish my studies, but preliminary reports are quite instructive. At any rate, these anti-Jewish outrages took place in Lviv, Stanislavia, now Ivano-Frankivsk, and in other cities. And thus, innocent population, because the guilty probably fled beforehand, suffered for the crimes of the Soviet authorities committed against the Ukrainian people. Again, the third factor in the Jewish-Ukrainian relations. To be sure, we are speaking of only a few instances, although they are blown out of all proportions by some Jewish writers, with a relatively small number of people involved. One of the sore points in the Ukrainian-Jewish relations, it seems, is the question of Ukrainian collaboration with the Nazis, particularly in the administrative and police fields. What is collaboration? The standard dictionary explanation is that it's cooperation with the enemy. As it was explained today for the Ukrainians, the question was, but who is the enemy? And whom are we to be loyal to? The answer was that there was no state to which the Ukrainians owed any loyalty, that they owed their loyalty only to the Ukrainian cause. For the Bolshevik record has been well established. I have seen the films made by the German groups as they came into these jails in Koblenz, in the Bundesarchiv. And I wouldn't want to relate some of the details, for they are horror stories, particularly one. It would be unfair to expose you to this inhumanity that I have seen on those films. The Bolsheviks, and I have a 360-page document from Vinnytsia, it's called the Massenmord von Vinnytsia, murdered 9,762 or thereabouts, and anyway, 10,000 people. 10,000 people. The world knows about the Katyń forest. Who talks about the Ukrainian mini Holocaust from Vinnytsia? The Ukrainians had a reason to abhor the Bolsheviks. This may help to answer some of those who say, why did the Ukrainians politically collaborate? Although it's nobody's business, essentially. The Ukrainians have the right to cultivate their own political objectives. They may be wrong, but that's their business. Now, as far as the collaboration is concerned, it must be understood, and I hope I'm not cut off by our chairman. You must understand that collaboration is not altogether an unheard of phenomenon. Everybody who lives in an occupied country and lives legally pays taxes, obeys laws, what have you, goes to school, collaborates. It is a necessity of life. You study the Japanese occupation in the Philippines, which I did once just for the sake of comparison, the Nazi occupation in any country or in any other occupied country, the conditions, you will see that it is an inescapable fact of life. Indeed, even the Jews who were persecuted were forced to collaborate by forming Judenrats that are so brilliantly presented by Isaiah Trunk in his monumental study called the Judenrat, and by forming a police, which in some cases perform very much the same functions as the other auxiliary police among other people. It is, as I said, an inescapable fact of life. Crucial question as far as collaboration is concerned is how did a given collaborator, because it has acquired a pejorative connotation, hasn't it? It is simply a good word, right? Somebody working with somebody else. Now the question is, how did a given collaborator use his office? Did he help the people, or did he tyrannize over them? From my studies, I concluded that not all mayors of towns, villages, what have you, posadniki, were self-serving puppets of the Nazi administration, nor were all the members of the indigenous police evil. Let me just briefly give you two examples. A mayor of Kremenchuk, a sizable town, who did everything that the mayor is supposed to do, collect taxes, send people to forced labor camps and what have you, collect warm clothing when Germans were freezing at Stalingrad, a collaborator. Yes, but this man by the name of Synica, and I have here a German report, Sicherheitsdienst report, this man spent much of his time getting Jews out of the ghetto from Kremenchuk, bringing them to a Ukrainian Orthodox priest, archpriest, having them baptized so that he could issue them false passports. And thus, he saved a great number of Jews. The Sicherheitsdienst discovered him, of course, because that's why we have the report, right? They knew that I had to read something finally. And he, his family, and also the archpriest and his families were executed. So much for judging collaboration. Police, well, I have here in my possession, which I recently obtained, a letter, not letter really, it's a notarized statement from Clara Zimmelstroper from Paris. And I shall not expose you to my French. It would be unfair. But in this letter, she tells of a story which is a very touching story. How she was saved as a girl in Lviv, and how she was hidden by an officer of the so-called Ukrainian police, an officer, mind you, not just a commonplace traffic cop. And she gives me the name, but I don't know whether the man lives in Canada, and now that you are on the threshold of finding good people and bad people, and she did not tell me that I could divulge his name, besides he could live in the Soviet Union, and having been an officer in the police, he could be exposed to unnecessary unpleasantries. I will not mention his name, but here it is. An officer in the police. Should we make these easy judgments about collaboration? I submit no. Now, having said that, I should hasten to add that I'm quite aware And that is well documented, particularly by Professor Hilberg, Raoul Hilberg, who wrote this gigantic book, The Destruction of European Jewry. Now, as I said, I'm aware that many members of the indigenous auxiliary police, that is referred to as the Ukrainian police improperly, so I must say, participated in various acts of violence against the Jewish people. What should be remembered, however, ladies and gentlemen, is that the basic fact that these people, the indigenous police in whatever country, they were an integral part of the German administrative or colonial, if you wish, apparatus, for whom the Ukrainian people bear no responsibility, because they were not accountable for their acts to a constituted Ukrainian authority. Their masters were masters of the Third Reich. Now, aside from the so-called Ukrainian police, there were also individuals who committed crimes against the Jews. But it should be noted that Ukrainians had no monopoly on criminality. Or to state it differently, every nation has its criminal elements, and Ukrainians are no different. However, studying this problem of civilian criminality against the Jewish people, Professor Stefan Posony of Stanford University wrote that according to the records of Israel's War Crimes Investigations Office, the rate of Ukrainian anti-Semitic war criminality was 3 per 10,000 of population. This, ladies and gentlemen, makes it, according to the figures provided by Professor Posony, the lowest in Eastern Europe. And I want you to be aware of another fact. It is precisely in Ukraine the Germans stayed the longest. And yet, the Ukrainian record is, in this respect, is something of which the Ukrainians, even if one could be proud of criminals, could say that after all, we were decent people. Perhaps it should be noted that while the Germans were pursuing with grim determination their policy of extermination of the Jewish people, the Ukrainian nation was also experiencing a struggle for survival against the Nazi regime. By the time that the war was over, according to the Soviet statistics, 5.5 million Ukrainians lost their lives. Over 3 million Ukrainians were in the forced labor force in Germany, and hundreds of thousands were dislocated, never to return to their normal daily life. Sometimes we forget that the Ukrainians were also suffering. I recently read a report, organizing my files, as it were, by Erich Koch. And he reports to Himmler what has happened in Volyn, where he discusses how the Ukrainian insurgent army denies to the German access to entire provinces and what have you. But he says we have been punishing them regularly. And he gives a list of 108 villages that were completely wiped out. 108 villages that were wiped out. And then he says, but there are some Banditenfrauen, the women of these members of the UPA, and their children that survived. We send them to a Trauniki camp where they are to be treated as prisoners of war, children and women. I'm, of course, discounting the fact also that Ukrainians had a fair representation in various concentration camps. So that should not be forgotten, that we were not, so to speak, to be treated on the level of master race. Yes, indeed, the Ukrainians were treated differently. A Jew was shot just because he was a Jew. They were more selective about the Ukrainians. They would destroy villages because the area was under the control of the Ukrainian insurgent army. That really does make some difference, although some people would say, well, if you're dead, you're dead. Well, I really don't view things that way. So while the Ukrainians were exposed to these horrors of war, yet in the midst of this inferno, there were noble individuals who risked their lives and the lives of their families in order to help Jews. I mentioned already two of them. The exact statistics of those true heroes of our century, we shall probably never know. A fair idea about them may be gained from the official German publications of the SS and the police of the District of Galicia from October 1943 to June 1944. I'm referring to these Bekanntmachungen. I was hoping that we would plaster the walls with them, but I see it hasn't been done yet because I brought quite a few of them. These announcements about people who were zum Tode verurteilt, condemned to death. So these assessments are based on these, of which we have quite a few. The originals are in the archive of the Zakordonne Predstavnictwo UHVR in New York, but the Central Liberation Council has been generous enough to share those documents with both the YIVO Institute in New York and Yad Vashem. I personally hand-carried those documents to Dr. Krakowski so that he could use them. On the basis of calculations from these documents, and it should be noted that a new law was passed by the Germans or rather promulgated. You didn't need to pass a law in Nazi Germany, you merely promulgated on October 2nd, 1943. According to the law, no less than 1,541 Ukrainians were sentenced to death. Many of the people were executed for belonging to the organization of Ukrainian nationalists or to the Ukrainian insurgent army, or it says specifically UPA. But included in this list were some 100 Ukrainians who were executed for helping or concealing Jews. The term that the Germans use is Judenbegünstigung. According to Philip Friedman, this was a substantial number when we take into consideration the following facts. One, only a part of the Ukrainians who helped Jews were apprehended and executed. Many were never apprehended, and some were given lighter sentences. Two, in many instances, those guilty of this so-called offense were executed on the spot and do not figure in the official statistics. Three, the death sentences cover only the period of October 1943 and June 1944, when the Soviet army was already in portions of Galicia. And four, the lists include only a part of the Ukrainian territory, namely the so-called District Galician, the District of Galicia. Now, after the war, some other people began to study this problem of Ukrainian-Jewish relations. What did the Ukrainians do for the Jews? That is, those who were looking for the good people, the people who did something positive. One of those people was a Yiddish writer, Joseph Schwartz. And he gathered testimonies about those who saved Jews. Among the more spectacular stories he lists are those of Alexander Krivoyaz's of Sambir, who concealed 58 Jews. Lev Kobylnitsky of Zavaliv, and I just confirmed the story when I talked to Dr. Sokolsky, because he's also from Zavaliv, my, so to speak, landsman. This Lev Kobylnitsky rescued 23 Jews, although he tells me 27. More than that, the foresters of Galicia saved altogether 1,700 Jews. Certainly an imposing record. On my way here from New Jersey, I was simply thinking about this gathering, about this conference, and I was pondering how much our world would have lost had a Ukrainian teacher not saved a little Jewish boy, Roald Hoffman, who later on was to become a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. Now he's professor of chemistry at Cornell University. How many of those Hoffmans perished, however? Well, at any rate, the attitude, one should also perhaps examine the attitude of the Ukrainian church. For next to the ON, the only second entity that exercised moral authority, though not political, was that of the Ukrainian church. And I'm here addressing myself particularly to the to the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and to the role of Metropolitan Andrew Sheptytsky. I would say it constitutes a separate chapter in the Ukrainian-Jewish relations. It is probably fair to say that Sheptytsky's courageous stand against the persecutions of the Jews has no equal in Europe. Not even the Pope stood up for the persecuted Jews, but Sheptytsky did. In February of 1942, he addressed a letter to Heinrich Himmler protesting the various anti-Jewish actions. He also objected in this letter to the Germans using the auxiliary police, or the so-called Ukrainian police, in the operation against the Jewish people. Later on in the year, or in November of 1942, the great Metropolite Sheptytsky also issued a pastoral letter to the Ukrainian people entitled, "Neubi, thou shalt not kill." Unfortunately, I have only a German translation of it. Sicherheitsdienst immediately had it translated, so I have it in German from the German archive, "Du sollst nicht töten." In this pastoral letter, Sheptytsky stressed the importance of this commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," and threatened excommunication to all those who transgressed. But besides taking a stand vis-à-vis the highest officers of the Third Reich, Sheptytsky also took an active part in rescue operations. Through his influence, and after all, he was the head of the Ukrainian church, some 150 Jewish children were saved in various Ukrainian monasteries. In addition, Sheptytsky concealed in his own residence in Lviv 15 Jews. If that is not the work of a righteous among men, I ask you, what is? And yet, he was not proclaimed a righteous man by the Yad Vashem. I could extend the list of the Ukrainians who proved their humanity by helping the Jews when it mattered. Indeed, do have many accounts from the German archives, from Yad Vashem, and from other places. I could even demonstrate on the basis of a German document that the much maligned ON provided Jews with false passports. I have that document with me. But would that make any difference for Jews who already decided that the Ukrainians are guilty? Would that convince Lucy Davidovich, the author of the war against the Jews, not to change a document as she did, so as to make the Ukrainians appear among the murderers in Babi Yar? Or would that cause the author of the novel Holocaust, Gerald Green, to reassess his position, for whom the Ukrainians are worse murderers than even the Nazis were? It breaks my heart to say so, but I don't think so. I think that the lure of the myth, built on misperception, fractional information, is more powerful force than the historical evidence. But I'm convinced that in the long run, the truth will prevail, and the Jews and the Ukrainians will face each other not only as good neighbors, but also as good friends. It is a cause worth working for. Thank you.